Welcome to European Journeys. This is an anniversary stage again. Last week we started with this series talking about the 200th anniversary of the death of Hans Nielsen Høyge, the evangelist of Norway. And a week later we have another anniversary to commemorate. Well, I want to say from the outset that we won't have anniversaries to commemorate every weekend, but it just happened that this weekend we have a major one to talk about. And this has nothing to do with the birth or the death of a major figure in history, but this anniversary has to do with the first performance of St. John Passion by Johann Sebastian Bach. It happened 300 years ago on the 7th of April 1724, in fact on the day that was then Good Friday. And so what we are going to do for this stage is explore the place where this happened. And so we are going to go, of course, to Germany, the country of Johann Sebastian Bach. And as you look at the map, we are going to go to the region known as Saxony-Anhalt. It is located on the northern parts of the border with Czech Republic. So as we zoom in, you see there that the major city of the region is Leipzig. Leipzig is the 8th largest city of Germany. And it is also a city with a long, ancient history, and also a history connected with trade, because in that city, two major roads of the German Empire passed there. They crossed each other there. One was Via Regia and the other one Via Imperii. In the 16th century also, Leipzig was a major center for the Reformation, as we know, with Martin Luther. And so it is there, in that city also, that St. John's Passion was performed for the first time. And the place we are going to visit is a church that is quite famous. It is Nikolaikirche in Leipzig. It is not the most important church of Leipzig, in fact. The most important church is Thomaskirche, but Nikolaikirche is famous for several reasons. There would be many things to say about that church. Firstly, the first Lutheran service of the city of Leipzig was performed there in the year 1539. And if we fast forward to the 20th century, there in that church started a prayer movement in the 1980s, yes, right during the communist times when the church was quite persecuted in the communist bloc. Well, a major prayer movement started there in that church, which led to the 1989 Monday demonstrations, which themselves led to the destruction of the Berlin Wall in November of that same year. Well, it all started with a prayer meeting. But we're not going to talk about that. We are going to talk about another event, the second, chronologically, second major event, and that is the first performance, of course, of St. John Passion by Johann Sebastian Bach. Firstly, let's talk a little bit about Bach and about his work there in Leipzig. Bach had been appointed as Thomas Cantor in 1723, that is a year before that performance, in Leipzig. Before that he had worked as Kapellmeister mainly for princely courts. He had also already worked for some churches, but he was mainly working for princely courts. And the latest was the court of Prince Leopold of Anhalt-Köthen. But that work left him unsatisfied. The princely family was not very interested with music, and Bach needed something new, a more rewarding position. Well, in 1722, the cantor of Leipzig, Johann Kuhnau, died, and so the position opened, and Bach quickly applied for the job. Well, you might think that it was an easy task for him to gain the job, but that was not the case. In fact, he was refused initially in favor of another giant of his time, and this man was Georg Philipp Telemann. But the negotiation collapsed. Georg Philipp Telemann refused the conditions offered to him, and therefore Johann Sebastian Bach was chosen instead. As Thomas Cantor, Johann Sebastian Bach he was responsible for the music of all the churches of the city. There were 4 churches at the time. And he was also the director of the School of Music, the music school of the city. And quite interestingly, that school, the building of that school, was none other than the former Augustinian monastery of Leipzig. And that's where as maybe you know, Martin Luther studied as a monk, so it's a very historic place. And that's where Bach worked as the director of the music school. Well, Bach might have quickly understood why Telemann refused the conditions offered. His task was very demanding, and yet he was poorly remunerated. Firstly, the music school itself was a charity school. That is, it was a school for boys, and the poorest boys of the city were gathered there to be educated. And it was the task of Johann Sebastian Bach to educate them, but he struggled to maintain the order, and let alone to teach them singing and music. So that was the first difficulty. Another demanding task was the fact that he had to compose a cantata for every Sunday service. So every week a new music based on the Word of God that had to be sung there in the churches, and he had to compose that and then to teach the kids who had to sing in the churches. And moreover, when it came to Easter or to Christmas or other Christian parties, Christian feasts, he had to compose full oratorios. So his task was very demanding. Sometimes I wonder if he thought that his previous job was not finally a better place for him. And yet, he stayed there as the Thomas Cantor in Leipzig until his death in 1750. Yet, yes, he had to lower his expectations in terms of quality, in terms of style, and yet there was a positive side to that. Since he had to write a lot of cantatas, his devotion to God had to deepen. He had to study the Word of God. He had to seek God more in order to be able to produce a good music. And so there was also a positive side there. And as a result, in fact, his best music, in fact, was composed. Some of his best music was composed during that time in which he was Thomas Cantor in Leipzig. That's just for an overview of what the role of Johann Sebastian Bach there in Leipzig was. Not very easy. Let's talk about the first Passion. Also, the preparations were not that easy. It was initially scheduled to be performed at Thomaskirche, the major church of the city. But at the last minute, it was moved to Nikolaikirche for some issues. And that obviously was not so easy because Bach had to prepare very carefully the place. And so at the very last minute, he had to find a new way of performing that St. John Passion there in Nikolaikirche. But as we know in history, in fact, it was an important place for a beginning like that. What was the purpose of the Passion? Well, St. John Passion was designed to present the biblical records of Jesus' last hours before his death, that is, from the chapters of the Gospel of John, 18th and 19th, and all of that in musical form. But his Passion was not the first in history. Other Passions had been written before him. Even in the time of Martin Luther, someone like Johann Walter put into music the Passions of St. John, according to St. John, and according to St. Matthew. Yet, Bach's Passion was an important composition for several reasons. First of all, the first Passions, the earliest Passions composed in the 16th century, were fairly monotonous, and the Gospel was sung often without pause. But later on, these compositions became more melodious, with more pauses and more variety in singing. But where Bach really excelled, it was that he was able to bring from abroad musical inspiration that others had done before him, but he managed also to keep the Germanic distinctive of devotional music. And so he was able to offer a great variety of melodies, of tones, and also a richer panel of expressions. And so this was done without losing, as I said, the devotional character, which was very specific to the German Protestant music. Well, as I said, he had been appointed in 1723. He had to compose a cantata every week, and he had begun to experiment a lot of new sounds to bring into his music. And there, in St. John Passion, he was now able to bring them all together in one oratorio. So that was quite an achievement for him. But we cannot talk about the Passion without talking about Bach's Protestant faith, and that was the most important element in his music. And in fact, he was there in Leipzig. Martin Luther had been a major figure in Leipzig as well. He had triggered the Reformation, as we know, not so far from Leipzig, in Wittenberg, 200 years earlier. And by the time of Bach, virtually all the city was Protestant. And the Bible was at the heart of the Reformation. Reformers like Martin Luther therefore advocated for Christian education for all children. And so Bach really enjoyed the fruit of such work that the Reformers had done. In his time, really, all German children had to learn, well, first of all, Christianity through the Catechism of Martin Luther. But secondly, what was the most important after theology, it was music. Every child had to learn music, every child had to learn singing. And so Bach was the fruit of that revolution in education that had happened with the Reformation. The Bible really formed the basis of his works, and his primary aim was really to communicate the life and work of Christ vividly, in particular in this Passion, according to St. John. And this success was such that Bach was later called the fifth evangelist, and his works were called the fifth gospel. Well, Johann Sebastian Bach has left a lasting legacy in music. Even rock music and jazz music today owes their existence really to the work that Bach had done 300 years ago. Yet, his compositions could have been forgotten today. In fact, after his death, the Passions were lost or were forgotten for about 100 years. It was only Felix Mendelssohn in the 19th century that recovered them and represented them to the general public. Today, in fact, his music is heard, especially during Easter time. We had that last week, all over the world, sung in churches and in music halls by the best singers of the world. And that's quite ironic because when we see the sort of choir that Bach had to deal with, maybe Bach never heard his music the way he wanted to, or certainly not the way we hear it today. So that's for the 300 years of the first performance of St. John Passion. If you like European journeys, I invite you to go to cedricrecentino.substack.com. You see the name there on the screen right now. And there, if you sign up, you will be able to receive articles and the videos in your mailbox. Thank you.